Hello. The title of this talk is The Seven Metals of Inner Alchemy Transforming Lead into Gold. And this isn't about physical gold, but rather the radiant gold that's within each of us. And that's to say, it's the virtues that we uncover when we refine and balance the distortions in our psyche. Now, these distortions or vices, they arise from one central root, which is greed. But greed here doesn't just mean a hunger for material wealth, it's deeper than that. We'll explore how these distortions are reflected in the seven classical metals or planets, from Wrath or Mars all the way through to greed and Saturn and beyond into true philosophical gold. And we'll look at the alchemical process and how it helps us temper them or purify those metals into virtues like patience, kindness, and humility. By the end, you'll have an understanding of exactly how to work these metals and how to transform them and take your first steps towards turning lead into gold in both your own life and if you work with clients, with your clients. You'll learn how to identify which of these aspects is rising up and how to effectively balance it. And this is really just a sort of overview of this. There's a lot more details in a course that I'm putting together on this, so check back for that. So, what is inner alchemy? Inner alchemy is the art of transformation or transmutation, while external alchemy is the process of turning lead into gold or one metal into another. And that was the pursuit of the ancient chemists. But the true purpose has always been symbolic, and to that effect, they used to call the alchemists who just did the lab work puffers because they puffed the bellows but didn't do the actual internal work. So, inner alchemy invites us to refine not metals but the unbalanced energies within ourselves and transmute them into something greater. So each of us carries distortions, which are vices like wrath, envy, pride, greed, etc. And these distortions don't mean that we're broken, they're simply unrefined energies or raw potentials that arise from the illusion of separation. At their core, these vices are rooted in one key distortion: the greed to assert our story as truth. So what does that mean? Well, let's consider this. Every time we feel anger, grief, or envy, we're actually responding to the gap between reality and the narrative that we've constructed about how things should be. Wrath, for example, arises when we demand that our perspective be heard and validated. I'm telling the truth and you're not listening to me. Grief, on the other hand, which is a subtler form of wrath, emerges when we mourn the collapse of a story we believe in. So it may be that someone's died and the universe hasn't given you the story of them continuing to be with you, or maybe it's a relationship that's broken down or something like that. Envy distorts when we think someone else's success diminishes our own, but here's the alchemical truth. Every vice contains the seed of its opposite virtue. So wrath, for instance, holds the seeds of patience and discipline, and grief can lead to acceptance and mercy. So the process of inner alchemy teaches us to recognize these distortions for what they are. Not flaws to suppress, but raw energies waiting to be refined. Now, here's the profound realization that's really at the heart of inner alchemy. The world you experience isn't reality as it is. It's the reality that you perceive it. Alan Watts captured this beautifully when he said, trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth. Everything we see in the world, everything we experience in relationships is filtered through the lens of our own stories, interpretations, and assumptions. So, just for a moment, consider this. In every interaction with two people, there are actually 6 players. There's the real me and the real you, and then there's my version of you in my mind, and your version of me in your mind, and my version of me in my mind, and your version of you in your mind. So there's 6 players there interacting, and in both of our minds, there's probably not actually a true representation of the real me or the real you. So every relationship, every conversation, and every conflict is actually a dance between these six players. This is why misunderstandings arise. We're not interacting with people as they truly are, we're interacting with the version of them that exists in our universe. And because their universe is equally valid, their story is true for them. This realization is liberating. It means that no one's right or wrong in an absolute sense. We're all experiencing reality through the lens of our own minds. And this brings us to a critical question in inner alchemy. Can I let this person be where they are? Do I need my story to dominate their universe? Or am I content for it to be true in mine? And this is the key to tempering the raw metals within us. Wrath softens into patience when we release the need to control someone else's perception. Envy transforms into kindness when we recognize that another's success doesn't diminish our own. Each distortion becomes an opportunity for refinement and balance. At the center of this work lies Tiferet, the sphere of beauty and harmony on the Kabbalistic tree of life. And Tiferet reveals or represents the inner sun, the fire that burns away impurities, leaving only truth behind. Imagine a phoenix rising from the flames, its old, unrefined self burned away to reveal something pure and new. This is the role of this divine fire in inner alchemy. It's not an external force, it's the truth within you, waiting to dissolve the illusions that keep you trapped in distortion. So we'll touch on this as we explore each of the seven metals, but for now, just let's move to the heart of today's journey, which is the seven metals, their vices, and the virtues that temper them. So let's look at the seven metals, vices, and their transmutation. We'll begin with iron, the metal of Mars, which is tied to the sphere of Geburah on the Kabbalistic tree of life. Iron represents wrath, one of the most primal and misunderstood vices. And wrath is not simply anger, it's the greed to be right. It's the fire that arises when we feel unseen, unheard, or invalidated. Wrath demands, acknowledge my story, see my perspective, and make it real in your universe. And when reality refuses to conform to that narrative, wrath often transforms into its quieter counterpart, grief. Grief is the mourning of a story that didn't play out the way we believed it should. So an example for wrath would be if you imagine a heated argument where both sides believe that they're right. From each person's perspective, their story is valid. Wrath erupts not because one person is wrong, but because the other refuses to validate the narrative. This is the dance of projection. I see you as a character in my universe, and you see me as a character in yours. So when the stories don't align, conflict can emerge. But wrath and grief, as painful as they are, aren't flaws. They're just raw, unrefined energies waiting to be tempered. To refine iron, we begin with its own virtue, patience. Patience is the ability to step back, to release the need to dominate or control, and to trust that truth doesn't require validation. But iron also requires mercy, the virtue of chesed, its opposite sphere on the tree of life. Now, mercy softens the edges of wrath, allowing us to see the humanity in others and to forgive them for existing in their own universe, and even to allow them to hold on to their truth. And it's worth pointing out here that a lot of the ideas that we believe are true are just beliefs. They're faith-based. You know, so many of our beliefs or our truths are actually inherited from our parents or society, and we don't have empirical evidence to say that they are definitely true. We have a lot of evidence from other people saying that this is how it is, but that doesn't mean that it's actually necessarily a truth. And from this point, we can bring in the idea of Tiferet fire. So if you imagine taking the hot energy of wrath, its intensity, its rigidity, and offering it to the central sun, Tiferet fire burns away the impurities. You know, we can look at this as things like the idea of facing the dragon's breath. You have to be pure to be able to face the dragon, pure of heart. You have to be pure to walk through the halls of Hades. The need to be right, the demand for control, the grief of unmet expectations get burnt away by this fire. So what remains is strength tempered by clarity and compassion. Wrath becomes a steady, controlled flame, like a sword forged in a sacred fire, sharp but balanced, and ready to be used if it's needed. But in most cases, it's probably not needed. Next, we have tin, and this is the metal of Jupiter in the sphere of Chesed. Now, tin's a metal that coats other metals, and it represents gluttony. But this isn't limited to food or drink. Gluttony is the greed to consume excessively, whether it's possessions, experiences, relationships, or even knowledge. At its core, gluttony stems from the illusion of lack, the belief that we're incomplete and that something external can fill the void. So have you ever felt the restless hunger for more success, more pleasure, more validation? Gluttony convinces us that if we just had enough, we'd finally feel whole. But you can't get enough of what you don't really need, as Alan Watts said. Gluttony blinds us to the abundance that's already existing within. So to temper tin, we start with its virtue, temperance. Temperance isn't about deprivation, it's about balance. It teaches us to discern what truly nourishes us and to let go of what doesn't. But tin also requires discipline, the virtue of Gebura, to create structure and boundaries for Chesed's expansive energy. Discipline ensures the abundance doesn't spill into excess. And here again we can invoke the fire of Tiferet. Imagine the restless, grasping energy of gluttony being offered to the sun. The fire burns away the illusions of lack and craving, revealing the truth that which abundance isn't something we acquire, it's something that we align with. After the fire's work, what remains is sufficient. The quiet knowing that we already have enough. So after tin we have copper, the metal of Venus, and the sphere of Netzach. We encounter lust. Lust is the greed for possession and pleasure. Copper lusts after gold. It's pretty, it's similar, but not quite there. It distorts love into craving, convincing us that we need to grasp and own in order to feel connected. But here's the paradox. Lust often arises from a disconnection with ourselves. When we feel empty or incomplete, we seek fulfillment outside of ourselves, projecting our desires onto people or things. We can look at this from perspectives of someone who feels weak, maybe looking for a strong man to look after them, or someone who feels like they're not handsome, going after the beautiful woman. And Carl Jung might describe this as the anima or animus projection, the search for our missing inner counterpart in the outer world. Lust isn't about love, it's about the fear of emptiness. So to temper copper, we start with its virtue, which is chastity. Chastity doesn't mean suppression, it means discernment. It's about honouring desire while recognising that true connection comes from within. Copper's further balanced by clarity, the virtue of Hod. Now clarity cuts through the illusions of lust, showing us the difference between superficial cravings and deeper authentic needs. When we bring lust to Tiferet's fire, the greed to possess burns away. And what remains is pure, expansive love, a connection that isn't grasping or controlling, but free and harmonious. After copper, we have quicksilver or mercury, and this represents envy, the vice of the sphere of Hod. And envy is the greed for what others have. It's the belief that someone else's success or happiness diminishes our own. Envy traps us in comparison, making us blind to the abundance within our own lives. Envy's insidious because it feeds on the illusion of separation. It says, they have something I lack, and their light makes my shadow deeper. But this is a distortion. The truth is, another's success doesn't take away from ours. It reflects the potential that exists within each of us. So to temper mercury or quicksilver, we start with its virtue, which is kindness. Kindness opens the heart to gratitude, reminding us that life's abundance is infinite. Quicksilver is also balanced by passion, the virtue of Netzach. Passion reconnects us with our unique gifts, inspiring us to celebrate our path instead of envying someone else's. When envy is placed in the fire of Tifereth, the illusions of lack dissolve. The fire reveals that every light we admire in others is a reflection of what's possible within ourselves. Then we have silver, the metal of the moon and the sphere of Yesod. Silver represents sloth, but not in the way we might traditionally think of it. Sloth is not laziness. It's the greed to avoid effort and cling to comfort. It's the inertia that keeps us stagnant, telling us to stay in the familiar rather than engage with the flow of life. Sloth whispers, stay safe, don't move, don't risk discomfort. It convinces us that rest is what we need, but in truth it leaves us stuck, disconnected and restless. At its heart, sloth arises from fear, the fear of change, growth or effort. So to temper this, we begin with its own virtue, which is diligence, and this awakens purposeful action, the willingness to step forward even when it feels uncomfortable. Silver is further balanced by harmony, the virtue of Tifereth. Harmony reminds us that life is not a static state, but a rhythm, a dance between rest and action, stillness and movement, mountains and valleys. Now let's bring silver to the fire of Tifereth. So if we picture the heavy inertia of sloth, the reluctance to engage with life, being placed into the sun's purifying flames, the fire again burns away the fear and resistance, reigniting the spark of vitality within. And what remains is the energy to move forward with purpose, not out of obligation, but out of joy. Movement becomes a natural expression of harmony, not effort. So then we actually move on to the fool's gold, or the metal of the sun, which is tied to the sphere of Tifereth itself. Now, fool's gold represents pride, one of the most subtle and deceptive vices. Pride is the greed for recognition and superiority. It's the ego's desire to be seen as special, to rise above others, to demand validation. But here's the irony. Pride often arises from insecurity. When we don't feel whole within ourselves, we seek external validation to fill the gap. Pride says, look at me, see me, acknowledge my worth. But in doing so, it creates separation. It inflates the ego while isolating us from genuine connection. So to temper fool's gold, we begin with its virtue, humility. And this doesn't mean diminishing yourself or hiding your light. It means recognizing your place within the whole. Understanding that your worth is intrinsic and doesn't need external validation. Fool's gold is further balanced by groundedness, the virtue of Malkuth. Groundedness anchors us in reality, reminding us that we are part of something greater, and that true strength comes from connection, not separation. Again, when we burn this with the fire within Tifereth, the illusion of superiority burns away. What remains is authentic self-expression rooted in humility. We can see that actually everyone's just as important in this universe as everyone else. You know, there is no man that's greater or lesser than any other man. So this transforms pride into humility, a strength that serves rather than separates. And then we come to lead. So lead is the heaviest and densest of the metals, and we've sort of covered the fact that all of these different vices are representations of greed. This is tied to Saturn in the sphere of Binah, and lead obviously represents greed, the root of all of these distortions. So this is the prima materia in some respects. Greed is the belief in separation, the compulsion to hoard, grasp, or control in an attempt to feel whole. Think about the energy of greed. It says, I'm not enough, I'm incomplete, I must take, gather, hold on to things to create a sense of security. Greed creates walls, separating us from others and from life itself. It's the voice of scarcity, the illusion that there's not enough to go around, the idea that I am me and this world is out there as something to conquer maybe. So to temper lead, we begin with its own virtue, which is charity. Charity dissolves greed by reminding us of the abundance that flows when we release the need to hoard. Charity is not just giving, it's the recognition that we are already connected to everything we need. And more than that, you know, it's also balanced by unity, the virtue of Kether, the crown on the tree of life. Unity reveals that the walls of separation are illusions, that we are not isolated beings but interconnected parts of a greater whole. When we understand that this universe is actually one single sphere of light bouncing through space and time, reflecting off vibrations in a quantum field and sending information back across the universe. So one way of looking at this is the sun. So the sun sends out its light rays and they bounce off the moon. Now between the sun and the moon, that light's invisible, it's black. If we look at it side on, we see nothing but blackness. It's only when we get that light directly into our eye as it's reflected off the moon that our mind converts this information that's coming from the wave of light into electrons and builds a picture in our visual cortex. But in reality, there is no separation between us and the moon and the sun. And there's no separation between the sun and all the planets. They're held together by gravity. There's all of these dances of interactions in our universe, in our galaxies, and in the interactions that we have. You know, the walking down a street. You know, we're interacting and walking through other people's electromagnetic fields of their hearts. There's a place in California, the HeartMath Institute, that's apparently been able to measure someone else's heart field going up to 21 feet around them. And they can apparently tell what someone's heart rate, with someone's heart field, what emotion they're feeling. And from one person's brainwaves, how many other people are in the vicinity and what all of their heart rates are. So we really are experiencing a unity rather than a separation. And there's much more on this as well when we actually start to go into universal consciousness levels and things like that. So if we take V.I.T.R.I.O.L, and bring lead into this central sun, this heavy weight of greed, the fear, the scarcity, the separation is burned away. And what remains is the lightness of being, the recognition that we're already whole and connected to everything. Lead, the densest material, transformed into gold, the purest expression of unity. So, as we've explored these 7 metals, their vices and their virtues, a deeper truth has emerged. All vices stem from one root, the greed to make our story real. And they're versions of this, but this greed itself comes from this idea that we're not one, we're separate from other things. So if you think about it, wrath arises when we demand that our story be acknowledged, pride inflates when we need our version of reality to dominate someone else's. Even envy and grief are tied to the gap between our narrative and reality. But the liberating insight here is that stories are void. They exist only in our minds, shaped by our interpretations and projections. When we truly understand this, we can begin to let go of the stories that keep us trapped. We don't need to erase them or fight against them. Instead, we can bring them into V.I.T.R.I.O.L's fire, allowing the flames to burn away the illusions and leave behind what's true. And I've done this myself in trance states, and I've also taken clients through this process in guided hypnosis and meditations. And we can really start to work this sort of energy through the symbolism of the unconscious mind when we're working in these self-meditative states or hypnotic states. And it's also where the concept of beginner's mind starts to come in, because beginner's mind is a concept rooted in Zen philosophy, and it invites us to approach life with openness and curiosity without clinging to preconceived notions or stories. It's a state of being where everything's possible because we're not bound by what we think we know. There's an old saying, don't believe me, don't believe anyone else, and don't believe yourself. V.I.T.R.I.O.L's fire and beginner's mind work hand in hand, dissolving the weight of our stories and revealing the gold within. So when we start to loosen our grip on what we think we are and what we think we know, we start to be more capable of change and more able to let go of all of these vices. And if we understand that every single thing that we experience in this world, from the moment we're born to the moment we die, is just a creation within our mind based on information coming in through the senses and passing through our filters and beliefs and being manifest into our universe and reality. It doesn't mean it's true for everyone else. So let them have their story. So I'd like to thank you for joining me on this dive into the seven metals. And each metal represents a part of our journey, a distortion to be refined, a virtue to be uncovered. It's an ongoing process and a lesson of integration. So, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there's a course on this that I've written that goes into way, way more detail. But remember, the gold you seek isn't out there, it's within you. Keep refining, keep transforming, and let the fires guide you. So until next time, take care and embrace the alchemist within.